The stomach is a sort of J-shaped enlargement of the gastrointestinal tract directly inferior to the diaphragm. It connects the esophagus to the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. Because a meal can be eaten much more quickly than the intestines can digest it and absorb it, one of the functions of the stomach is just to serve as a mixing chamber and a holding reservoir. After food is ingested, the stomach forces a small quantity of the material into the duodenum, that first part of the small intestine. Empty, the stomach is about the size of a large sausage, but it's the most distendable or stretchable part of the gastrointestinal tract, and it can accommodate a large amount of food, especially on Thanksgiving, right? So as we look at the stomach layers, the muscular layers are 3 layers of smooth muscle. There's a longitudinal layer, a circular layer, and an oblique layer. Because these muscles are arranged in different orientations, when the muscle fibers contract, the food is being squeezed in many different directions. So this mixes and churns and causes a peristaltic action of moving and mixing and back and forth. So the digestive juices in the stomach get mixed in with that food. The second layer of the stomach is the mucosal layer, which is going to obviously secrete mucus. But in addition to that, it secretes hydrochloric acid, some active and inactive enzymes, and some hormones. Now, when we look at the regions of the stomach, we divide that into 4 main areas. The cardia, or cardiac region, which is the upper part, sometimes also called the fundus, okay, or a part of the fundus. Here's more of the cardiac region, here's the fundus, so very closely associated together. The main body of the stomach, and the pyloric area, which is the distal end of the stomach. So the cardia surrounds the opening of the esophagus. The rounded portion that is superior and to the left of the cardia is the fundus. So very, very closely associated together with each other, and that fundus allows for a lot of extension of the stomach or distension of the stomach when it's filled. Inferior to the fundus is the large part of the stomach called the body, and the body, of course, is going to lead to the pylorus, which is going to connect with the duodenum. So when the stomach is empty, if you look at the lining of the stomach, there are lots and lots of folds called rugae. Those rugae, again, allow for that stomach, the folds in the material you can think of, allows for distension as that stomach fills. Now, when the stomach is pushing food out into the small intestine, it's going to pass through an area that is a sphincter. You know what a sphincter does. It opens and closes, and this is the pyloric sphincter. So it allows food to pass from the stomach into the first part of the small intestine, which is the duodenum. Several minutes after food enters the stomach, peristaltic waves pass over the stomach every 15 to 25 seconds, and that pushes food toward the pyloric sphincter. If the food is still too big to pass through, it's pushed back for more churning and churning. Another round of propulsion starts, and if the food particles are still too large to pass, retropropulsion occurs and the food is pushed back again. So this squeezing back and forth is going to continue until all of the contents are mixed with the gastric juices and reduced to a really soupy liquid called chyme. Once the food particles in chyme are small enough, they can pass through the pyloric sphincter, and that's what we call gastric emptying. And we talked briefly before about how the food can serve, or how the stomach serves as a reservoir. So during that time that the food is in there, it's being broken down into smaller and smaller and smaller liquidy parts so that it can be pushed through in that emptying process. Now we're going to look at the second 2 actions, the secretion of the gastric juices and the components of it, and the gastrin that is secreted into the blood, on the next couple of slides. So let's begin by looking at the different cells that are found in the gastric glands of the stomach. The stomach's made up of the same basic layers as the rest of the gastrointestinal tract, but it has some modifications. The surface of the mucosa is simple columnar epithelial cells. Obviously, we know what those look like, right? So those are going to create the lining, as you can see here in this image. Here's our simple columnars. The epithelial cells are going to extend down into the connective tissues that make up the lamina propria, and they form columns of secretory cells called gastric glands. And the gastric glands are going to open into the bottom of narrow channels called gastric pits. The gastric glands contain exocrine gland cells that are going to secrete their products into the stomach lumen. So we'll look at some of those cells and what they secrete. In these gastric pits, we have mucus cells, obviously going to secrete mucus, and this helps to form a protective barrier that prevents the stomach from digesting its own walls with all of the acids and digestive enzymes that are secreted. At the bottom of the list over here on the right, you can see the G cells. Those G cells are going to secrete gastrin, and gastrin stimulates some of the other cells called parietal cells to secrete hydrochloric acid, and also causes chief cells to secrete pepsinogen. And we're going to cover those in a minute, but I thought it was important to talk about the gastrin first because it's causing the other cells to secrete. So gastrin stimulates the secretion of the hydrochloric acid and the pepsinogen, but it also causes the lower esophageal sphincter to contract, and that helps to increase motility of the stomach, and it helps to relax the pyloric sphincter so that emptying can occur. Now let's move back up and talk about those parietal cells. So the parietal cells are going to secrete intrinsic factor that you should have learned about when you learned about blood cells and learned about anemias. So intrinsic factor is needed for us to be able to absorb vitamin B12 across the walls of the intestine, because that B12 is used for erythropoiesis. The parietal cells are also going to secrete hydrochloric acid. So they can be stimulated by several different sources: acetylcholine, released by parasympathetic neurons, the gastrin, we just talked about from the G cells, and histamine, which is released by mast cells. The acetylcholine and the gastrin stimulate the parietal cells to secrete more hydrochloric acid in the presence of histamine. So in other words, histamine works synergistically by enhancing the effects of acetylcholine and gastrin. The acidic fluid of the stomach kills many of the microbes that are in the foods that we eat. Hydrochloric acid can also denature or unfold proteins in food and stimulates the secretion of hormones that are going to help with the flow of bile and pancreatic juices. Enzymatic digestion of proteins also begins in the stomach. The only proteolytic or protein digesting enzyme in the stomach is pepsin, and that's secreted by the chief cells. Pepsin is going to cut or sever certain peptide bonds between amino acids, breaking down a protein chain of many amino acids into smaller protein chains, so fragments of that protein. Pepsin works best at a pH of about 2, so in a very, very acidic environment, and it becomes inactive at higher pH. So think about this for a minute. What keeps pepsin from digesting the protein in the stomach walls while it's digesting the food? Well, first, pepsin is secreted in an inactive form called pepsinogen. Remember, gen at the end of something usually means inactive or the created version. So in this form, it can't digest the proteins in the chief cells that produce it. Pepsinogen's not converted into pepsin until it comes in contact with hydrochloric acid that's secreted by the parietal cells or active pepsin molecules. Second, the stomach epithelial cells are protected from the gastric juices by a thick layer of alkaline mucus that's secreted by those mucosal cells. Another enzyme in the stomach is gastric lipase, secreted by the chief cells, and that's going to split triglycerides, fats, and oils that are found in fatty molecules in our food, such as we have in milk, into fatty acids and monoglycerides. This enzyme, though, has a limited role in the stomach of the adult, and it operates best at 5 to 6 pH. Now, more important than lingual lipase or gastric lipase is the pancreatic lipase. So that's where most of the lipids are going to be digested, and that is going to be secreted from the pancreas into the small intestine. The stomach only absorbs a very, very small amount of nutrients because most of its epithelial cells are impermeable to most of the materials that are a part of the contents of the stomach. Within about 2 to 4 hours after eating a meal, the stomach has emptied its contents into the duodenum. But when you eat foods that are rich in carbohydrates, they spend the least time in the stomach. High-protein foods stay a longer period of time, and emptying of the stomach is slower after a meal that contains a large amount of fats. And as you've seen before, I've got a couple of slides in here just to give you an overview of what's going on in the stomach. So the different cells, what they secrete, and what those secretions do. So you have the mucous cells, the parietal cells, the chief cells, and you have the G cells, what they're secreting, what those enzymes and those hormones are responsible for. And then, of course, the muscularis layer, which is going to cause that mixing, and the pyloric sphincter, which regulates movement of substances into the duodenum. I want to look just briefly at some homeostatic imbalances associated with the stomach, and that includes gastritis, which is just an inflammation of the stomach wall that can have many different causes. A peptic ulcer or gastric ulcer develops in about 5 to 10% of the population of the United States. So an ulcer is just a lesion in a membrane, and ulcers that develop in part of the GI tract that are exposed to the gastric juices are called peptic ulcers. One of the most common complications of these is bleeding, which can lead to anemia if enough blood is lost. In acute cases, the peptic ulcers can lead to shock and death. There are 3 major causes of peptic ulcers, and these include the bacterium Helicobacter pylori, the use of non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, NSAIDs like aspirin, and hypersecretion of hydrochloric acid. But usually the H. pylori is the most common cause of the pelvic ulcers. There are several things that have been helpful in the treatment. Some things that can be avoided, such as cigarette smoke, alcohol, caffeine, and NSAIDs that impair the mucosal defense mechanism. So cutting back or stopping the consumption of those can lead to some successful treatment. Also, if it is a result of H. pylori, usually antibiotic treatments can help resolve that. Oral antacids such as Rolaids, Tums, and Maalox can help temporarily block some of that gastric acid production and neutralize it. If hypersecretion is the problem, then you need hydrogen ion blockers such as Tagamet or protein pump inhibitors like Prilosec, and this can stop those parietal cells from secreting excess hydrochloric acid. And then finally, vomiting, which is something almost all of us are familiar with. That is called emesis, and it's the forcible expulsion of the contents of the upper gastrointestinal tract through the mouth. The strongest stimuli for vomiting are irritation or distension of the stomach, but other stimuli can include unpleasant thoughts, unpleasant sights, something that causes that general nausea, general anesthesia, dizziness, certain drugs such as morphine. Vomiting involves squeezing of the stomach between the diaphragm and the abdominal muscles, and that expels the contents through the esophageal sphincters. Prolonged vomiting, especially in infants and the elderly, can be very serious because it leads to the loss of the acidic gastric juices and can lead to a condition known as metabolic alkalosis, where you have a higher than normal blood pH. It can also lead to dehydration with the excess loss of fluids and corrosive damage to the esophagus and the teeth.